All right. Well, we welcome you. As I initiated, I'm Joe Kiley. I'm the Vice President of um, Operations for the Ports to Plains Alliance, and I have with me today Jack Schenendorf, who is the federal consultant, works for Covington and Burling, does a lot of our federal work with us. And so as we go through here, if you've got questions, stop us and we'll be sure we ask that. You can ask to ask questions on the online and we'll try to get to those answers too. So Jack, I'm going to turn this over to you.
And what does
Go ahead,
that mean?
Jack.
Can you hear?
Yes, Jack.
Okay. I'm going to give a update on what's going on in Washington, and I've divided the presentation in half. The first half is going to be a little bit of the background of what's going on in Washington and other areas, because it does have an impact on the transportation, and then talk about transportation and where the bills are. So if anybody has any questions, as Joe mentioned, feel free to break in if there's something you don't understand. If not, we'll have time for questions at the end as well. Let me start by saying that one thing to do is to kind of keep in perspective what we're trying to accomplish overall in this program, and then with respect to the Ports to Plains. And one of the starting points, and to keep in mind, because this is really critical, is that the Eisenhower generation after World War II built the interstate system, and they built a new system that had excess capacity in it, and that has served us as a nation very, very well. But as you'll see, we've come to a crossroads where we have an aging system and it no longer has that excess capacity. But that's what we started with, and for the last 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, we have enjoyed that. It's helped prompt economic growth, and it's something that I think, a lot of people take for granted, but as you'll see, there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done. The surface transportation is financed at the federal level through a series of grants, and almost all of the grant money goes to states and to localities, and they then decide how to spend that money on developing their highway and transit systems within the priorities that Congress sets. The last major bill was the Safety Lou bill, and that was a 6-year bill. It provided about $287 billion over that period. It expired on September 30th of 2009. Congress, in theory, should have had a multi-year bill, a new one, in place then. It did not, and what we've had is really a series of extensions through September 30th of this year. We'll talk a little about the future extensions, but basically went through September 30th of this year. In Safety Lou, one of the things that they did was to set up 2 national commissions to look at future needs in this country, what kind of investment we need to make in our transportation network. I was fortunate enough to be able to serve on one of those 2 commissions, and I'm just going to highlight for you now, I like to call it transportation crisis, facts are stubborn things, because these are facts, and it's something that the policymakers have to deal with, although sometimes they try to avoid it. The first is related to the fact that I mentioned that the interstate was new, but is now wearing out. It's reached its design life. It's had far more traffic, far heavier traffic than was ever anticipated. And so part of what we have to do over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years is going to be to rehabilitate and in many cases replace major sections of our interstate highway system. A very expensive proposition. The factoid I like to use is the Woodrow Wilson Bridge went over the Potomac River here in the Washington, D.C. area, cost $14 million to build, was just replaced at a cost of
What I suspect is it wrong.
Pardon? Okay. The next thing, in addition to preserving and replacing our existing system, we also have to provide additional capacity. This is a set of maps of the freight rail system, and if you looked at maps of the interstate highway system, it would look the same way. And the map on the left is the system as it was in 2006, mostly green. You can see some red hot spots, but for the most part, it's a functioning system. On the right, you see a map in 2035 with the existing economic growth that we would hope would take place during this period if there's no additional capacity on our freight rail system. And the interstate highway system looks the same way. It turns to gridlock. And again, part of that, we don't recognize it necessarily, but is that the interstate had excess capacity built into it. And so it was able to absorb the growth and in fact encourage the economic growth that's taken place, and it was able to accommodate that. Well, in the future, it's not going to be able to accommodate that, and we're going to come into gridlock, and that's what's going to hurt American businesses. In addition to having to preserve the system, and in addition to having to provide the additional capacity, we also have a financing crisis with the financing mechanism that has funded the interstate system and has funded surface transportation for the last 40 years. And that's the Highway Trust Fund. And basically it's insolvent. The taxes have not been increased since the early 1990s. They have basically lost 70% of their purchasing power since then. We're using more fuel-efficient vehicles. We are using, we're converting over to non-gasoline-powered and diesel-powered vehicles, so that's a loss of revenues. And so the trust fund is in a position right now where it can't support the current levels of funding. It cannot support even the current safety levels of spending if they were projected out into the future. So what that means is that we either need more revenues into the trust fund, or we're going to have to reduce investment. And this is one of the big problems that the Congress is grappling with now as it tries to reauthorize the programs. The recommendations that our commission made, and frankly, study after study, report after report, commission after commission has come to the same conclusion. And that's one, we do need to reform the program. We need to streamline the program. We need to make sure there are no more bridges to nowhere. And so the program needs to be reformed and give a greater focus on a national mission. But reform itself is not enough. We also need to invest a lot more than we're investing today. On that graph you see there, the green bar represents the current level of spending. The next bar over is the cost to maintain the system. And so you can see we're not even spending enough to adequately maintain the system. And then the bars to the right are two different scenarios for actually improving the system. And of course, if we don't want to have the gridlock that we saw on that other map, we have to move into this section, which is to actually make improvements and to add capacity to the system. We also made it very clear that there's no free lunch. You can't maintain the system, you can't add capacity to the system without investing more. These projects are costly, but it has to be done, and it has to be paid for, and if it's going to be paid for, that means you have to raise the revenue. Again, this is a critical part of what's now holding the bill up from moving forward. I think most of the groups in Washington in the transportation-related area are encouraging the Congress to act with boldness and to be resolute in the fact that we need to do something. Just doing nothing and letting the status quo go and what that is producing means we just fall further and further behind, and we really do need to move forward expeditiously. So where are we then with trying to get the transportation legislation through? And let me start with kind of in general on what's going on in Washington. And the atmosphere in Washington now is, and this is the earliest that I've seen it in my time up here, is really focusing, whether they talk about it or not, on the 2012 elections. We know that the Republican candidates are all lined up and are fighting with each other as to who's going to be the Republican candidate. But even behind the scenes in Congress, the parties are beginning to position themselves for that 2012 election. What do they want the issues to be? Where do they want their party positioned on it? Who's going to win the spin war on what the issues are? And so the framing of the issues, the positioning with respect to those issues are starting to play a pretty big role in what Congress does and does not do at this point. The single biggest set of substantive issues that are in the forefront of what's going on in the Congress is our federal deficit, debt, and the federal budget. And you all have read about that in your papers, I'm sure. There are really, when people talk about it, there are two distinct problems. One of them is a short-term continual increases in the deficit, which are just adding to the debt. In this last year, 42 cents of every dollar was borrowed that the federal government spent. And if you look out over the next 10 years, we're on a projected path to add $6 trillion to the federal debt from what it is today. So that's the short-term problem, looking in at this next 5 to 10 years and trying to change that spending. But there's also an equally, and maybe even more important, is the long-term structural debt that the country has, caused mostly by an imbalance of our major entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the revenues that we're collecting to pay for those programs. As the population ages, more and more people collect Social Security, apply for and are eligible for Medicare. The costs go up exponentially, and the revenue base is not adequate to provide for that, and so something has to be done. That's called the long-term structural deficit. On the right, you see a graph from the General Accounting Office, GAO, and you can see they have basically two graphs. The blue one is kind of what the current baseline is extended out. The red dotted one is what they think the policies are going to be, and they think it's going to be even worse than the extended baseline. But whether it's one of those or the other or something in between, the same picture exists, and that is we're building up debt at an exponential basis, and it's beyond what the government can handle at the federal level, and consequently you're going to have a very difficult situation in the long term. So Congress is trying to deal with both of these problems. Both the short-term deficit, and they're talking at least about what they're going to do for the longer-term deficit. But these two clouds are hanging over, and it's part of the reason that the United States was downgraded in its creditworthiness, looking at this both the combination of the short-term and the long-term debt. So what Congress has done is taken a first step. and just passed recently, I'm sure you read about, the Budget Control Act of 2011. And that allowed the president to increase the debt ceiling by somewhere between $2.1 and $2.4 trillion based on some things that are in the bill, but in that range. And in exchange for that, there was a reduction, there was an imposition of discretionary statutory caps on what can be spent through the appropriations process. Those statutory caps are going to save about $900 billion over the next 10 years. And this act also created, and you'll be reading a lot about this, you probably have already read about it, the so-called Super Committee, the Joint Select Committee on Budget, on Deficit Reduction. And they've been given a task of coming up with $1.2 to $1.5 trillion in additional savings. And so if they do what they're supposed to do and the discretionary caps do they're in law already, that would produce about $2.1 to $2.4 trillion in savings that would offset this increase in the debt ceiling. So that was the theory behind it. The Super Committee, if it does not come up with the savings that are anticipated, then there are provisions in the law which will automatically cut back on programs. Both defense would be hit heavily, Medicare would be hit heavily, and so that's kind of a hammer that's out there, and the theory is that hammer will force the Super Committee to act on come up with something that would meet this target of $1.2 to $1.5 trillion. So all this effort, all this focus on the deficits, the debt, the discretionary caps, what the Super Committee is all on cutting spending, making government smaller. Some people would like to add revenue to the picture to say that we can look at revenue, but this focus is on getting spending under control. And that, of course, is running contrary to what we're saying needs to be done in transportation, which is to increase spending. So a program like transportation that has a legitimate need to increase its spending is swimming upstream, and that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to move these bills in this current climate, because all of the focus is on reducing spending, reducing the size of government, and saving and helping to reduce the size of the deficit. Just to give you a sense of how big these numbers are, 2.1 trillion is a big number, and if you could count at one number per second, which of course you can't do because once you get up to a high number it takes you a while to say it, but let's pretend that you could say it in 1 second. And let's say that you were going to count every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. How many years would it take you to count to $2.1 trillion? And I was surprised to learn it would take you 66,500 years of counting at one number per second to reach $2.1 trillion. So we are talking about big numbers when we talk about these budget issues and the problems with the deficit and the debt. The Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction that was set up under the Budget Control Act, again, it has to cut recommendations for $1.2 to $1.5 trillion. They will be doing their work, and they are supposed to have their work product completed by the end of November, just before the Thanksgiving break. And then there's a set of expedited procedures that would allow the House and Senate to then both vote without filibusters, without amendments, on that package by a couple of days before Christmas. And then in theory that bill would be signed into law by the President by the middle of January. So they have a very specific time frame. And so a lot of what goes on in Washington these next 2 to 3 months is going to be focused on what is this Joint Select Committee doing? What is it coming up with? It can look at anything. It can look at any kind of spending cuts, changes to entitlement programs, additional revenues, and all they have to do is to net out at the targets they were given. So in theory, they could include things in their bill that would increase spending, and as long as they did something to either raise revenue to cover that spending or cut other spending elsewhere, they could do that as long as they ultimately meet their targets. So a lot of the energy in Washington is going into trying to figure out what is this committee going to do, how are they going to conduct their business, what things can we get in there, what can't we get in there, and is something going to go on that's going to hurt us. And so this is taking up, it's really sucking the air out of Washington, and this is where a lot of the attention is going to be. There's a lot of uncertainty in this process, a lot of lines being drawn in the sand. For an example, Congressman Boehner, Speaker of the House, said they need to do their business, but they shouldn't consider any new taxes. President Obama said that he would veto a bill that didn't have new taxes in it because taxes should be part of the solution. You have people pushing to really do a big deal and come up with changes in the entitlement programs. You have other members saying that there shouldn't be any changes in Social Security or Medicare, and we ought to deal with this in other ways. And so a lot of people are kind of drawing a line in the sand. The important thing to do at this point is to kind of pay attention, if you do pay attention to it, to what the leadership is saying, Republican and Democrat in the House and Senate, because these members on the committee, there are 12 members, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, they are going to be listening to their leadership, obviously. And so we're getting a lot of conflicting signals right now. We're going to have to see how this plays out. In general, they could come up with 3 outcomes. One is they could stalemate and vote 6-6. They can't find any agreement on how to proceed to reduce the deficit. Another is that they come up with bare bones compliance. Some people call it picking the low-hanging fruit, finding the least objectionable ways to cut the budget and just barely make their target of $1.2 trillion. And then some people think that the president will step in at some point and the leadership of both parties in the House and Senate will see it in their interest to come up with a much bigger package, maybe $4, $5, $6 trillion that really starts to change that long-term structural problem that we have as a nation. So nobody knows which direction it's going to go in at this point, but everybody's trying to position themselves to take advantage of whichever section it goes to. Compounding this problem is the president's job package that he's set up, which is the $400 to $500 billion range. Does have some money in there for about $60 billion for transportation infrastructure. It's paid for by tax increases of various sorts, and so you've got an issue with the Republicans with that. But nevertheless, this is also out there. Some people think it'll get rolled into what this big super committee does. Some think it'll just stay on its own. But it's a factor that's out there. And then today, and I haven't seen the details of it, but the president released his $3 trillion deficit reduction package, which is what he's asking the super committee to do in effect. And as you can see, he's asking for much more than the 1.2 or to 1.5 trillion, and his package has in it significant tax increases. So again, it's going to be very controversial. But all this is going to be playing out, and the transportation bills are trying to move in this climate when all of this is being dealt with. So where are we with respect to transportation reauthorization itself? And there, the level of funding is a key issue, and there are really three choices. Is it going to be at a reduced level that the trust fund can support? That's about a 35% below where it is today. Or will it be at current levels, the safety levels just extended out? Or will there be a significant increase in funding the way these commissions have called for and the way businesses have called for, and be paid for with user fees? The other issue will be the length of the bill. It could be 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. So let's look at where the reauthorization stands right now. In the Senate, they are currently looking at a current level plus inflation for a 2-year bill. So the Senate is in effect saying, we can't come up with the revenues that we know we need. Let's give ourselves a couple more years. Let's get past the 2013 election, and let's deal with the long-term issues then. But of course, as I said before, the trust fund can't support the current levels, so they have to come up with $12 billion in revenues. And Senator Inhofe has said for him to support this package, the $12 billion has to be bipartisan. Republicans have to agree on what that $12 billion is, but come up with $12 billion to offset, to essentially pay for keeping the program at current level. That would be $6 billion a year for 2 years. The House has taken a different approach. They've taken an approach of cutting the program back to live within the trust fund's means and to be basically sustainable funding for the long term. And they've taken a 6-year bill, and they're following the House Republican leadership, which is no new revenues. And so they really have no choice. Once you buy into the no new revenues, then you have to cut the program back, because otherwise the trust fund would be insolvent. So the Senate's looking for a little bit of revenues. The House is not looking for any revenues, and so you're going to have a big difference in the level of spending in the two programs. To get these multi-year bills finished, right now both the House and Senate have just released outlines. They have not released the text of their bills, and so an additional extension is going to be needed. And so the House and Senate committees, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee and the EPW Committee, agreed to a 6-month extension to March 31st, 2011. That was enacted last week. They passed it, and the President signed it. There's a slight reduction in funding for the highway program.
Jack, did we lose you?
Can you hear me?
Okay, I got you back.
Okay. How long was I off for?
Just a second there.
Oh, just a second. Okay. So it's a 6-month extension. It was enacted last week. It's represented as being at the current level, but there's actually about 7% less money for highways. But again, that won't make a big difference in the program level as long as the states are allowed to spend some of their older money. They'll be able to keep the program at current levels. Whether or not they can keep the money at the current levels is be seen in the Appropriations Committee. And the Appropriations Committee, the House, this hasn't been passed yet. The House has started work on their bill, and they would keep programs at current levels, which means the transportation programs, at least at this point in time, will be kept at the fiscal year 2011 levels, the same as the safety levels in the last year of that bill. Now, with the approach they're taking on their extension on this continuing resolution is different than the Transportation Subcommittee took, where they started on the new House view, and they actually cut the program down from 43 billion to 27 billion in their bill, but that bill is just pending now, and this continuing resolution is going to supersede it at least for till November 18th. So the House is moving with a short-term extension of appropriations till November 18th. That will keep the transportation programs at spending levels that are basically current. And of course, we'll have to wait to see what future extensions mean when they actually produce a bill that goes from November 18th till the following September 30th. So in the transportation area, there's a lot of uncertainty. The first piece of uncertainty is in 2012. And the House had wanted to go down by that 35% reduction, whereas the Senate wanted to keep current law. And so you've got an impasse there, potentially, between the two bodies. And right now, the House has moved in the Senate direction. The House, at least in the short term, is saying for the purpose of these extensions, okay, we'll keep it up with the current level of spending. But that still has to get worked out for the rest of fiscal year 2012, what the level is going to be. In the reauthorization, of course, you have that same issue out there. Is it going to be the current level of funding for 2 years, or is it going to be a reduction for 2 to 6 years to 35%? Now, the House had seemed intent on moving their bill forward. They thought that they had a very sound argument that the program needed to live within the trust fund's means, and this is all the trust fund can support, so let's go forward with it. But now you have this jobs issue out there, and I think the Boehner, Speaker Boehner, and Cantor, the majority leader, have basically, I would say, gotten cold feet about the idea of moving a bill that cuts a job-producing program like transportation at a time when there's a big focus on how are we going to create more jobs, and the President has sent up a big $500 billion jobs package. It's very difficult to move a bill forward that cuts the program by 35%. So how is that going to play out over the next 4 or 5 months as they head into the election? Are things going to change where the leadership feels comfortable with moving the bill, or are they going to continue saying this isn't the time to move this bill and basically just keep giving extensions and really delaying consideration of the House bill? Now, the Senate seems like it's going to be ready to act much more quickly because they're trying to keep the current level of funding. And the real question in the Senate is, are they going to be able to get a bipartisan agreement on where to come up with $12 billion to supplement the trust fund spending in order to maintain those current levels? If they do get an agreement on this, I think they'll move quickly and try to get their 2-year bill through the process. If they don't get agreement, then they're going to find themselves in the same position as the House, which is it may not be clear how they're going to move forward quickly. So one question in these situations is there a way to pull a rabbit out of the hat? And there are a couple of things out there that could break the impasse that transportation is in. And that is that the super committee, what it's trying to do, the Bowles-Simpson Commission came up with recommendations a while ago that certainly will be something the super committee looks at. And the Bowles-Simpson Commission, because they realized how important transportation was to economic growth, they basically provided for a 15-cent increase in the gas tax and invested all of that in transportation, which was a very good thing for the program. The so-called Gang of Six that produced their own proposal, they essentially indicated that the trust fund needed $131 billion over the next 10 years, and they recommended doing that. In both cases, it was because of the importance of transportation to our economy, and so it isn't inconceivable that the super committee might not do something similar and have a package in there that basically provided the revenue the trust fund needs for a potentially even a big bill moving forward in the near future. In addition, the president's jobs proposal that he sent up has $60 billion up front on transportation investment that looks like a stimulus investment. I don't think the Republican leadership is going to react well to that, but that $60 billion could be used to add to the trust fund so that the multi-year bills could be up at a higher level of spending. And so some people are starting to talk about that as maybe a better way to spend the money, and one that Republicans might be more inclined to support than a program that looks kind of like a stimulus, make work jobs type of program. With respect to Ports to Plains, obviously we have the policy paper that you're all familiar with, or you can get from Joe or Michael or Duffy if you haven't seen it. We support the increased funding overall, because if there's more funding overall, then routes like Ports to Plains and rural areas are going to have a much better chance of getting money at the state level. And so we have a big stake in how this funding issue gets resolved, and how we eventually bring members of Congress around to the point they've got to come up with big increases in funding if we're going to have the kind of transportation network we need for the future. One thing that's very important here is that, and you see this a lot in the House because they were looking at a 35% reduction, is talking about innovative financing. And innovative financing is wonderful. It's public-private partnerships. It's various types of tolling, various types of TIFIA loans. These things are all good. They're wonderful. There are certain projects that can benefit from them, and they ought to be used. But these are essentially urban, high-density corridor kinds of financing, and it doesn't really work in rural areas where you don't really have the traffic loads to justify it. So we've got to make sure our members understand that innovative financing, as good as it sounds, it's not going to help Ports to Plains. We also need to make sure that the bill is highway friendly. I do think Senator Inhofe in the Senate is going to make sure of that. I think Congressman Rahal, Micah in the House will probably be okay. But certainly this administration would like to push the program in the direction of, we don't need any new highway capacity. We have enough. Let's take care of the highways, but we don't need any new capacity. And that may be a very legitimate debate to have in major metropolitan areas. But in rural areas that have two-lane roads that are carrying more heavy traffic than they can handle, you need to have a functioning four-lane road, and that additional capacity in rural areas is absolutely essential. We'll be looking at the bills when they eventually come out to ensure that they have a rural focus. Again, if there's not a great deal of money, but there is innovative financing to help urban areas, then that means even more that the funding stream has to be directed more toward rural areas. Same thing on a freight focus, which would help Ports to Plains. And we also need to make sure that the bill is friendly to NHS kinds of routes. There are some in Washington and in some of these more conservative think tanks out there that say, well, let's just focus on the interstate system and give everything else back to the states. Well, we do need to focus on the interstate. Nobody's going to argue about that. But national highway system routes, corridors like Ports to Plains, are part of our national system and need federal investment the same way that the interstate needs it. And so we have to make sure that members don't lose sight of the fact that you can't define the federal interest as being the interstate system, that there's much more to our national transportation network than just the interstate. So those are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at. We haven't seen drafts of either of these bills yet. One of the most important things, obviously, is the level of funding, and that